The day Margaret Collins first heard the words thyroid nodules, everything in the doctor's office suddenly felt smaller. The chair felt harder, the room felt quieter, even the ticking clock on the wall seemed louder than before. She was 67, living in North Carolina, a retired school librarian who had spent most of her life believing that health problems were something you managed quietly, responsibly, and then moved on from. But the tone in the doctor's voice didn't match that belief. "It's common at your age," he said, scanning her report. "We'll monitor it. Most nodules are harmless." Most. That word should have been comforting, but it wasn't. Because Margaret had already done what most people do when they hear something unfamiliar inside their own body. She had Googled it, and the internet had filled in the blanks with fear. Now she sat there trying to act normal while her mind repeated the same phrase over and over again. "Something is growing inside me." That night, she barely slept. Not because of pain, but because of awareness. Awareness has a way of changing how your body feels, even when nothing has physically changed. The next morning, her daughter Claire noticed immediately. "You didn't sleep," Claire said, placing coffee on the table. "I did," Margaret lied gently. Claire gave her a look that said she didn't believe it, but she didn't push. Instead, she placed her tablet beside her. "I found someone you might want to listen to," she said. Dr. Janine. She explains thyroid health in a really simple way. Not scary, just understandable. Margaret hesitated. At her age, she had learned to be careful with internet voices. Everyone online seemed to promise certainty, fixes, secrets, but uncertainty was exactly what she was drowning in, so she listened. Dr. Janine's voice was calm, steady, almost conversational, not dramatic, not urgent, just grounded. She explained how thyroid nodules are often discovered incidentally, how many people live with them without symptoms, and how fear often grows faster than the condition itself. Margaret found herself leaning forward without realizing it, but what stayed with her wasn't a solution. It was a sentence. "Your body is always communicating. The key is learning to listen before reacting." For the first time since the diagnosis, Margaret didn't feel like she was being pushed toward panic or denial. She felt like she was being asked to observe, and that changed something. Over the next several days, she stopped treating every sensation in her body like an emergency. Instead, she began noticing patterns, how her anxiety increased when she skipped meals, how her sleep worsened when she stayed on her phone too late reading medical forums, how her throat felt tighter when she spent hours thinking about worst-case scenarios. Nothing about the nodules had changed, but everything about her experience of them had. Claire noticed the shift too. "You seem calmer," she said one evening. Margaret thought about it for a moment. "I think I stopped arguing with myself," she replied. That didn't fully explain it, but it felt true. Still, fear doesn't disappear easily. It returns in waves. And for Margaret, the second wave came one afternoon at the grocery store. She was standing in the aisle reaching for a box of tea when suddenly she felt it again. That thought, what if it's getting worse? Her hand froze mid-air, her breathing changed slightly. And just like that, she was back in the loop, body scanning, mind spiraling, imagining outcomes she had no evidence for. She left the store early. That night, she sat quietly in her living room, frustrated with herself. "I was doing better," she whispered. Claire sat beside her. "You still are. You just had a moment." "But what if I can't control this fear?" Margaret asked. Claire shook her head gently. "Maybe you're not supposed to control it. Maybe you're supposed to understand it." That idea stayed with her longer than anything else. Control versus understanding. Because control had been her first instinct since the diagnosis. Understand everything. Fix everything. Prevent everything. But her body wasn't responding to control. It was responding to pressure. And pressure, she was slowly realizing, made everything feel worse. That night, she watched more of Dr. Janine's content, not searching for miracles, but for clarity. One idea stood out again. Stress doesn't just affect how you feel, it affects how your body maintains balance. Margaret leaned back in her chair. She thought about the last few weeks. The fear, the sleepless nights, the constant mental checking, and she realized something uncomfortable. She hadn't just been monitoring her thyroid, she had been overwhelming her entire system with fear. And her body, in its own quiet way, had been reacting to that. Not dramatically, but persistently. The next morning, she made a decision. Not a medical decision, a behavioral one. She would stop feeding fear first thing in the morning. No phone searches before breakfast, no symptom checking in the mirror, no mental rehearsing of worst-case scenarios. Instead, she would start with routine. Simple, grounding routine. Tea, breakfast, light movement, fresh air. At first it felt unnatural. Her mind kept reaching for old habits. But she stayed consistent. And slowly something shifted, not in the nodules themselves, because she had no way of measuring that at home, but in her internal environment. The constant tension in her chest eased slightly. Her sleep improved. Her appetite stabilized. And most importantly, the fear stopped feeling like it was in charge. One afternoon, she went for a walk in the park near her house. The trees were beginning to change with the season, leaves turning warm shades of orange and gold. She stopped near a bench and sat down. For the first time in weeks, she didn't scan her body for danger immediately. Instead, she just sat, watching people pass by. An older couple walking slowly together, a child chasing birds too fast to catch them, life continuing without interruption, and she realized something simple but powerful. Most people were not thinking about what was happening inside their thyroids. Most people were just living. That thought didn't erase her condition, but it softened her relationship with it because she was beginning to understand something important. Not every discovery inside the body is an emergency, and not every sensation is a warning. Sometimes it's just information, and information doesn't always require panic. It requires awareness. That evening, Claire called. "How are you feeling today?" she asked. Margaret paused before answering. "Less afraid," she said honestly, "not because anything changed, but because I stopped feeding the fear all day." There was a quiet pause on the line. Then Claire said, "That sounds like progress." And for the first time, Margaret agreed without hesitation. Because progress wasn't what she had expected it to be. It wasn't a dramatic cure. It wasn't instant certainty. It was something quieter, more stable, more human. But life, as she would soon learn, still had one more lesson waiting for her. And it would come at a moment she least expected. A follow-up scan appointment, where she would finally have to face not just the numbers on a report, but the story she had been telling herself about them, and whether that story was helping her heal or keeping her trapped. The appointment was still ahead, and so was the truth she hadn't fully understood yet. Not about her thyroid, but about fear itself. Thumbnail line: Thyroid fear isn't truth. The week of Margaret's follow-up appointment arrived faster than she expected. Not because time had moved quickly, but because her mind had spent the entire week alternating between two states: calm acceptance and sudden fear, spikes she didn't fully control. Some mornings she woke up steady. Other mornings she woke up already checking herself mentally before she even got out of bed. But something important had changed this time. She didn't immediately panic about the fluctuations anymore. She simply noticed them. That alone felt like progress. On the morning of the appointment, Claire insisted on going with her. "You don't have to face this alone," she said while grabbing her keys. Margaret nodded, though part of her felt conflicted. Because for the first time, she didn't feel like she was walking into danger. She felt like she was walking into information, and those two things were not the same anymore. At the clinic, the waiting room felt exactly like it had before: bright lights, quiet murmurs, the soft rustle of paper. But Margaret noticed something different now. Her body wasn't in full alert mode, her breathing was steadier, her thoughts were slower. When her name was finally called, she stood up without that familiar rush of dread tightening her chest. Small change, but meaningful. The doctor reviewed her results on the screen, clicking through images and numbers with calm efficiency. "Well," he said finally, "there's no significant change." Margaret blinked. No significant change. Her mind repeated it slowly, trying to interpret it emotionally before logically. Claire squeezed her hand slightly. "So, that's good, right?" Claire asked. "Yes," the doctor replied. "We'll continue monitoring, but there's nothing concerning at this point." Margaret nodded slowly, but her reaction surprised even her. She wasn't overwhelmed with relief. She wasn't collapsing into fear either. She felt something quieter, stability, not resolution, not panic, just stability. On the drive home, Claire glanced at her. "You're really calm," she said. Margaret looked out the window for a moment before answering. "I think I finally understand something," she said. "What?" "That I spent more energy reacting to the idea of the nodules than living with the actual situation." Claire didn't respond immediately, because that was exactly what had been happening. That evening, Margaret sat in her kitchen again, the same place where this entire journey had started. But it didn't feel like the same place anymore. She made tea slowly, intentionally, and sat down without immediately reaching for her phone. Instead, she just thought. Not spiraling, not analyzing, just thinking. She realized something important. The nodules had not disappeared, but her relationship with them had changed completely. At first, they had been a symbol of danger. Then they became a source of fear. Then they became a daily mental burden. And now, they were just a health condition being observed calmly by doctors while she learned how to live without letting them define every moment of her day. That shift was bigger than she had realized. Later that night, she watched Dr. Janine again, not for reassurance this time, but out of curiosity, and one idea stood out again, but now it landed differently. Your body responds not just to physical conditions, but to the environment of your thoughts. Margaret leaned back slowly. That sentence used to feel abstract, now it felt obvious. Because she had lived it. Fear had not changed her thyroid, but it had changed her experience of living with it. And when she reduced the fear, her life became lighter. Not cured, not perfect, but lighter. The next morning, she woke up before sunrise. Instead of reaching for her phone, she simply sat up in bed and listened to the quiet house. For the first time in a long time, her first thought wasn't about her condition. It was about the day. She got dressed, made breakfast, and stepped outside for a short walk. The air was cool and still, and as she walked, she noticed something subtle. She wasn't scanning anymore, not her throat, not her body, not her thoughts. She was just walking, present, grounded, alive in the moment instead of trapped inside analysis. When she returned home, Claire was still asleep. Margaret sat on the porch instead of going inside immediately. She watched the morning light spread slowly across the neighborhood, and she realized something quietly powerful. Healing wasn't always about change you could measure on a report. Sometimes it was about the change no one else could see. The shift from fear-driven living to awareness-driven living. And that shift had already happened inside her. Later that day, she wrote in her journal, "I am not my diagnosis. I am my response to it." And for the first time, she believed it fully. Not as encouragement, but as truth. As weeks passed after the appointment, life slowly returned to rhythm. Not perfect, not problem-free, but no longer dominated by fear. She attended her book club again. She cooked without overthinking her health every hour. She laughed more easily with Claire. And the nodules, once the center of her world, became something she only thought about during scheduled check-ins, not constant monitoring, just appropriate awareness. One afternoon, Claire hugged her and said, "You feel like yourself again." Margaret smiled softly. "I think I stopped trying to fight myself," she replied. And that was the real transformation, not disappearance of a condition, but disappearance of constant fear around it. Because in the end, Margaret learned something she never expected when this journey began. The hardest part of healing is not always the body. It's the mind learning not to turn every signal into a story of disaster. And once that changes, everything else becomes easier to live with. Not because life becomes perfect, but because fear no longer leads it. Thumbnail line. Stop thyroid fear now. Margaret didn't notice the full change all at once. It revealed itself in small, almost invisible moments, like silence returning to a room that had been too loud for too long. A few weeks after her appointment, she woke up one morning and realized something unusual. She hadn't thought about her thyroid the moment she opened her eyes, not even once. She just woke up. That realization made her pause in bed, as if waiting for her mind to catch up and remind her what she was supposed to worry about. But nothing came. No fear wave. No mental checklist. Just quiet. She slowly placed her feet on the floor and stood up. The routine of the morning followed naturally, bathroom, tea, light breakfast, but without the emotional weight it used to carry. Even the mirror felt different, not threatening, not investigative, just reflective, a surface, not a judgment. Downstairs, Claire was already in the kitchen scrolling through her phone. "Morning," she said casually. Then she looked up and paused. "You look rested." Margaret smiled slightly. "I slept without waking up in the middle of the night for once." Claire set her phone down. "That's huge." It was. But Margaret didn't feel like celebrating loudly because the most surprising part wasn't the sleep. It was the absence of constant mental noise. The fear had not vanished dramatically, it had simply loosened its grip. Later that morning, Margaret went for a walk alone. This time she didn't announce it. She didn't overthink it. She just put on her shoes and stepped outside. The neighborhood felt familiar, but her experience of it was different. Before, every walk had been partly physical and partly mental surveillance, checking sensations, scanning for symptoms, replaying worst-case scenarios in the background. Today, none of that was active. She noticed trees instead of thoughts, air instead of analysis, steps instead of symptoms. Halfway down the street, she stopped near a small bench under a tree. This used to be a fear checkpoint for her mind, a place where she would sit and check in with her body. But today, she didn't check anything, she just sat. And that's when something unexpected happened. A memory surfaced, not of illness, but of her life before all of this. She remembered organizing books at the library, helping a child find a story they loved, laughing with co-workers during slow afternoons. A version of herself that wasn't constantly monitoring her body. And she realized something simple but powerful. That version of her hadn't disappeared. She had just been buried under fear for a while. Not lost, just covered. Back at home later that day, Claire noticed her mother sitting on the porch for a long time, just watching the wind move through the yard. "What are you thinking about?" she asked. Margaret took a moment before answering. "How much time I spent waiting for something bad to happen, instead of noticing what was actually happening." Claire sat beside her. "And what is happening now?" Margaret looked around slowly. "Life," she said simply. "Just life." There was no dramatic emotion in her voice, no overwhelm, just recognition. That evening she opened her journal again, but this time she didn't write about symptoms or fear cycles or medical concerns. She wrote about attention, where it had been, where it had gone, and where it was now returning. "I used to live inside my fear of my body," she wrote. "Now I am learning to live inside my life again." Days continued to pass, and something subtle but important began to happen. Her identity started shifting back. She was no longer someone with thyroid anxiety. She was Margaret again, a woman who read books slowly in the afternoon, who made tea without overthinking it, who called her friends back without hesitation, who existed outside of her condition. The thyroid nodules were still there, but they no longer occupied the center of her identity. They had moved to the background where most health conditions belong, monitored, understood, but not worshipped by fear. One afternoon, Claire came home earlier than usual and found her mother in the kitchen baking. "You're baking again?" she asked, surprised. Margaret smiled. "I felt like it." Claire leaned against the counter. "You know, I think something really changed in you." Margaret didn't look up from the mixing bowl. "I stopped treating every sensation like a warning sign," she said, "and started treating it like information instead." Claire nodded slowly. "That sounds like Dr. Janine's thing." Margaret chuckled softly. "Maybe, but I think I finally understood it my own way." Later that night, she sat alone again in the quiet kitchen. The same space where fear had once felt so heavy, but now it felt ordinary again, safe in a normal way, not because uncertainty had disappeared, but because it no longer controlled her response. She thought back to everything she had experienced, the panic, the sleepless nights, the constant scanning, the gradual understanding, the slow return to calm. And she realized something she hadn't been able to see before. Nothing external had fixed her mindset. It had changed because she changed how she related to uncertainty itself, and that was the real turning point. Not the scan, not the supplement, not the diagnosis, but the moment she stopped believing every internal signal required fear. As the night settled, she closed her journal and leaned back in her chair. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't trying to solve anything. She was just living inside the moment she was in. And that, she realized, was enough. Not perfect, not permanent certainty, just enough. And for Margaret Collins, that was everything. Thumbnail line: "Break free from thyroid fear."